Monday, everyone. I'm Martha with Nature Niche, and I'm here today with Mike Bishop.
Hi.
He is a recently retired faculty from the biology department of Alma College, and he's the director of the Alma College Bird Observatory. And we are going to talk about bird migration and bird banding.
Cool.
So what do you think, in general, folks should know or might not know about bird migration?
I think probably the thing I find most people are surprised about is that most of our songbirds migrate at night. Our bigger birds, hawks, waterfowl, most of them are diurnal migrants. They migrate during the daytime. But there are exceptions. There are some both raptors and some ducks that migrate at night. But virtually all of our songbirds migrate during the nighttime. And there's a lot of hypotheses as to why that is. It could be because they're less likely to be preyed upon. Other suppositions are that more often than not, nighttime atmospheric conditions are a little bit more calm than they are in the daytime because you don't have the heating from the sun. That obviously isn't always the case, but in general. One of the big things is that most nocturnal migrants have a star map in their head, and they use that to navigate. So
Cool.
they can see the stars, and they know where the North Star is, or at least they know where north is. And people have done studies where they've taken birds during migration and put them in planetariums and rotated the stars, and the birds orient, tracking the North Star.
Yeah.
So that may be another reason. Now, birds can also detect polarized light. So even on overcast days in the daytime, they can follow the sun's path, and that the zenith also tells them north and south. So diurnal migrants can use that. But in any event, I think that's the thing that most people are often surprised to find. And what's cool about it is that it's an easy thing to observe. While you can't see them, if you go out on any clear night and listen, particularly in the spring if the winds are out of the south, or in the fall if the winds are out of the north, you can hear them because migrants have specific calls that are unique that they use during migration.
Okay.
And so we now actually have the capability of recording these, and we have software that will identify those birds by their calls. And so we're now using these as ways to survey birds and get ideas of how many of these things are, and not only how many are moving through, but what species are moving through.
Okay.
So, for example, we've been using radar for a while to determine the numbers of birds, but radar doesn't tell us what they are. We just know that.
So you pair the two, and
with these two, right? We can now know not only numbers, get relatively accurate counts of numbers, but we can also start to know what species are moving when. So, in September and October, go out in the evening on a clear night, about a couple hours after dark is when most of them are up, and just listen, and you'll hear these they're always little single note or maybe two note, chirps and tweets, and they can be anywhere from 100 to 1,000 feet overhead. I mean, they're most of the time they're flying, at about 1,000 feet, but they can fly higher, but generally they're at about 1,000 feet or a little less than that.
Very cool.
So yeah.
And a lot of times people think everything goes north, everything goes south, but that's not necessarily
right.
true.
Yeah, you've got, obviously, birds are heading toward their wintering grounds, and for birds in North America, that is to the south. But the actual, migration and a point is going to be determined by several factors, not just where is their ultimate destination, but things like what are some of the topographic features that they're going to encounter. So the Great Lakes are a good example. Birds don't like to, particularly land birds, don't like to cross big bodies of water if they don't have to. And so if they hit a shoreline, they're probably going to follow that, and if it happens to be running east and west. So think of the Upper Peninsula. It's very common in the spring that birds will come up and they'll get to that shoreline, and they may be somewhere around Marquette, but they'll start heading east or west because they don't want to cross, because they can't see anything, right? It's just water.
Okay.
And then they get over to Whitefish Point, or they get over to Wisconsin, and they can go around the ends.
Okay.
And so you can get these local movements that are not north or south, for reasons that have more to do with just obstacles that they might be encountering.
Okay.
Now, to me, the coolest thing is that, you know, many of our birds that are neotropic migrants, so these are the ones that are heading out of the United States, either to the Caribbean or Central or South America. Many of those birds cross the Gulf of Mexico. Well, that's a huge body of water, you know, far larger than the Great Lakes. And they do that in one go. It's about 600 some miles from, say, the Texas coast to the Yucatan Peninsula. And they do that flight in one.
Even our hummingbirds.
Even our hummingbirds. Yes.
Yeah, I was reading about that.
Yeah, you hear people say, no, they catch rides on the backs of geese. It's like, nah, no, they don't. But it is, I mean, it's remarkable. You know, so these birds are doubling their weight usually. And when they leave Texas, by the time they land in the Yucatan, they will have completely used up all that fat, and they often are breaking down muscle mass, so they're actually, they weigh less than they did pre-fat weight. And they do that in around 30 hours or so it's nonstop. And what's interesting is, so the Gulf, you know, there's islands in the Caribbean, but the Gulf, there are no islands in the Gulf, right? But there are now, because there's oil derricks. And so what happens is, when you get a weather event that puts these birds down, in the past, that just meant you went into the Gulf and you were dead.
Right.
Well, now they land on these derricks, and if you go online and you just type in, you know, bird migration, oil derricks, Gulf of Mexico, you'll get these pictures that these guys take where, you know, a weather event happens and there's just birds on every vertical or horizontal surface on these just lined up, and you can often identify all the warblers and everything, Baltimore Orioles and all the other things that cross the Gulf. So yeah, it's pretty amazing. I mean, the physiological feats that these birds pull off for these migrations are just, you know, astounding. You know, I'd have a hard time finding my way to Panama with a map. You know?
Right.
And these guys do it all in their head.
Yeah. So could you talk a little bit about bird banding research, what you do, kind of what are the tools, and what the data is used for?
Yeah, so bird banding started in Europe, but it happened in North America shortly after that. And it's been organized in North America for about 100 years. The banding lab had its 100th anniversary a few years ago, and it was initially started primarily for tracking migration. It was also primarily looking at game species, waterfowl in particular, but almost all of our waterfowl migrate. And so they wanted some way to be able to try to learn what the migration paths were. So they figured if they marked these animals and they started getting recoveries, primarily from hunters, obviously, they could learn what are the migration routes that these animals are using. And once it got established, it spilled over from game species into everything. So you know, so now actually there are far more non-game birds that are banded in a year than there are game birds. Interestingly, though, there are massively more recoveries of game species than there are non-game, because hunters, you know, and they know what to do. That's probably an even more important, is that they encounter a band, they know what to do with it, because you just learn that. If a person finds a bird on their, you know, step that hit a window and it has a band on it, they might know, but probably not.
So what should they do?
So that you can be a citizen science, a citizen scientist, and if you aren't too freaked out with picking up a dead bird, just record the number, write the number down, and then go online, and if you just type in bird banding lab, that's all it'll take. It'll take you to the website, and then on the splash page of the USGS Patuxent Banding Lab website, it's how to report a bird band. It's in huge letters right at the top. You just click that button and just follow the directions. It'll walk you through it. You don't have to know what the bird is. You don't have to know anything about it. What they want is, where are you? When did you find it? And what was the disposition of the bird? Why do you have it, right? You know, the cat brought it in, or hit a window. You know, did the bird die? Sometimes it hits a window, recovers, and it flies away. You know, it'll ask for all that kind of information. If you know what it is, great. If you can give any, you know, if you know if it's a male or a female, great. But mostly they just want to get that basic information of why you've got it. And then two things happen. If the bird is in the database, so like, for example, the birds that I banded today, those aren't in the database yet. So if someone finds that, they're going to go punch it in and nothing's going to happen because I haven't, you know, submitted those data yet. But if it's in the database, you'll get an immediate pop-up that'll tell you where that bird was banded, who, what its species was, what sex, all that kind of thing. And you will ultimately get a certificate. So the banding lab will send you a certificate that says thank you for, you know, participating in the banding, and they'll give you a little more information about the bird. The bander also gets a notification. So I get an email that says, your bird number such and such was recovered at this location at this date. The bird was, hit by a car or whatever it is, and then I can use that in my data. And so the banding lab has two primary jobs. One is to manage all of the bands that they send out to us banders, right? And keeping track of those. But the other is managing the data and the recoveries. So being able to not only know what birds were banded, but what birds are recovered. And so recoveries fall into two basic categories. There are the recoveries that are birds that I band, that I recapture. Those aren't necessary to be reported to the banding lab. They aren't really as interested in those. But those are real important for my research.
Sure.
But when I catch a bird banded by someone else or vice versa, those are what we call foreign recoveries. Those are what the banding lab wants to know, because that's how they identify everything from timing to migration routes and so on with birds. And so that was the whole purpose of banding. Now we can use it for other kinds of studies. My interest is, while I band during migration, the focus of my personal interests are breeding studies and looking at population and how the demographics of populations change in terms of the ages of birds. Banding allows me to do that because by identifying individuals, I then can determine how much of my population is made up of new birds every year. How much is made up of returning birds. How many baby birds are coming off the nest at the end of the summer. How many of those might be coming back to breed in the same location. And I can't answer those kinds of questions if I can't distinguish one individual from the next. So I can tell a wood thrush from a robin, but one wood thrush looks like any other to me, right? So that the banding allows me to do that. But migration studies really were the kind of the impetus for the formation of the banding lab, and it's still a very important part of banding. So there are banding stations here in Michigan. Probably the most well-known one is Whitefish Point up in UP, and they have an extensive owl banding program, and they are banding primarily northern saw-whet owls, but they catch other owls as well. They have banded songbirds in the past. They aren't currently doing that. We do have some important migration stations in the southern part of the Lower Peninsula at the Kalamazoo Nature Center. They have a huge spring and primarily fall migration banding program that goes on.
Have there been major trends or kind of recent observations from all that effort?
From banding, well, a lot of people heard about the recent study that showed the dramatic decrease in birds in North America. Some of that has come from banding, although banding isn't the most ideal way to estimate populations. Most of that is from some of these other, like looking at radar during migration, that kind of stuff. But banding lab or banding data does supplement and corroborate a lot of these losses. So in my years of banding, I have seen declines in some species. I've seen increases in others. The first question I always have to ask is how much of that is habitat? Right. So particularly here, when we started banding here 16 years ago, where we're sitting right now looked very different than it does now. And so that habitat change is going to obviously affect the kind of birds that we have. But even at my other station, which is a much more mature woodlot, the woods there and the bog, which is in the middle of the property, that has not changed probably, well, the woods haven't changed since I've been there because they're over 100 years old. We got a deer that was trying to come over and
say hi.
Has shot at 15 minutes of fame, and he totally blew it. At that station, I can make a little bit more confident predictions on declines or increases that aren't being influenced by habitat. So for example, over there, I've seen a pretty significant decline in my ovenbirds. And that I suspect has to do with declines on the wintering ground, because my habitat hasn't changed. It's still healthy habitat for ovenbirds, but it's not what it was when I first started. So more than likely, something's going on because what we know now from both banding studies and other kinds of studies is regional breeding populations go to the same wintering places. They don't just go anywhere in the wintering range. They go to specific places. So, you know, my ovenbirds are going to a specific place in Puerto Rico, and that's where they're spending their winter. And so if that scrubby forest that they spent the winter in got turned into a condo, they don't have any place to go.
So that's an important main concept, is that to support our migratory birds, you have to have good quality and consistent
over
habitat
a large
on both
geographic
ends.
and in between, right? Their stopover is important. So we refer to stopover habitat as the habitat these birds are using as they make their migration, because they aren't doing it all in one flight. They're doing it over the course of, you know, several weeks, and so they need quality habitat. One of the important things that we've learned from banding studies is the kind of foods that birds use, and particularly during the fall, when a lot of birds are utilizing fruit because it's abundant. Once we know which of these plants are important to their migration, we can plant these in things like parks, right? And,
our own backyard.
Or our own backyards, right? And so we can, you know, normally a city would be pretty much a desert to a bird during migration, but if you've got green spaces in those cities where you have some of these fruiting shrubs available, they'll use them. I mean, it's not that they're afraid to land in the city, it's just that I'm not going to land there, there's nothing to eat.
Right.
But if there's water features and there's food in people's backyards, in parks, in greenways, you know, we now are providing support for these birds during these migrations. And so yeah, providing these in our backyards are just, you know, terrific, because there's plenty of backyards around. But most of our lawns, again, are pretty deserty when it comes to providing food, particularly if people have lawn services that are depleting insect populations. You know.
Plant our native plants as host plants to different insects. So there are caterpillars, things for the birds to eat. And shrubs that have
fruit.
The berries, like dogwoods and
elderberry.
Sumac.
Sumac would be another good one. Yeah, right. And the other thing that I strongly encourage people to do is find out what are the species on your local weed ordinance. Because very often they are species that should not be on them. For my, personally, weeds for me on an ordinance would be things that are problematic for us. So, you know, ragweed, right? Well, goldenrod is always on the list. Nobody is allergic to I shouldn't say that. Maybe somebody's allergic to the sap of goldenrod, but nobody is getting hay fever from goldenrod. Anything that's got a nice showy flower is an insect pollinated plant. It's got sticky pollen, it doesn't have airborne pollen. Goldenrod is a great plant to have in your yard. First of all, it's gorgeous.
It is beautiful.
Second of all, it is home to gazillions of insects. And so milkweed is another one. You know, milkweed, and most people know now how important that is for monarchs, but there are other lepidopterans that utilize it as well, several moth species, and it also has a really pretty flower. And if you don't like the little flyaway seeds, you know, just cut off the seed heads at the end of, you know,
before they form.
And it's got a rootstock, so it'll come up year after year. As a matter of fact, you end up fighting it because it wants to go everywhere. And goldenrod's the same way. It can take off. But these, you know, so find out what your local weed ordinances are, and then talk to your local city about changing those to include or exclude these species that are often put on there just unknowingly, because people are ignorant about what the problem may or may not be with these plants.
So one last question to wrap up. Where would you recommend people go if they want to observe fall migration, see some neat migrants?
Right, so we live in a great place for migration because, as I was saying earlier, birds definitely take advantage of topographic features for migration. And since we live in a state that is a north-south peninsula, our two coastlines are concentration points for everything. Waterfowl, raptors, songbirds, shorebirds, you name it. And we have lots of parks and wildlife refuges along that. So, you know, from Midland, you know, Tawas Point is what, an hour away? Nyanquin Point isn't even that far. Penconning Park, Shiawassee National Wildlife Refuge is a phenomenal place during migration for all kinds of things. If you want to see white pelicans in the middle of Michigan, go down to Shiawassee right now. But then we've also got a lot of green spaces in places like the Chippewa Nature Center, and other local and county parks. Cemeteries are great places to bird watch because they often have a lot of mature trees, particularly older cemeteries, and so they're a good place to find a lot of things like woodpeckers and so on. So. But the other thing that I would recommend is, contact our local Audubon chapters. So Midland has its own Audubon chapter, Bay City has an Audubon chapter, Mount Pleasant has an Audubon chapter. Contact them; they can identify places for you. We have a lot of watershed conservancies.
Yes.
There's the Shiawassee, or three.
There's Little Forks.
Little Forks, thank you. The Little Forks. There's the Chippewa Watershed Conservancy. They have properties that they manage where people, and they often, pre-apocalypse, they would have bird walks and so on, but those will resume when things get back to normal. So yeah, we live in a really great location for a lot of opportunities. And then if you want to go further afield, there's places all over the Lower Peninsula, and then of course the Upper Peninsula is just my favorite place on the planet. It's just gorgeous, and so except for the black flies, but I can deal with them.
Well, thank you so much
Hey, no
for
problem.
your time,
I enjoyed
Mike.
talking to you.
That was great information, and thanks for listening, everyone. Go out and help
See some
support.
birds.
Yeah, see the birds. Help support migrants.
Plant some plants.
Take care.